Hi everyone, welcome again. In the previous session, we had discussed the overview of the Indian economy, whereby we talked about what exactly are we going to study in this particular reading, and we talked about that we are going to study about the structural slowdown that happened in 2019-2020. We saw two possible reasons for this. One is a structural reason, the other was a cyclical reason, and we said that it is a combination of these two reasons which is actually responsible in apart from the global financial crisis. So it's a trioca of three reasons that exactly led to the crisis that we faced in 2019-2020. Then we talked about the structural problems that developed in the growth engines, the aftermath of GFC, and the fallout of what had happened in terms of the twin balance sheet crisis. So we saw the balance sheet of a corporate company, we also saw the balance sheet of a bank, and how these balance sheets were getting more problematic. Now the issue is that the root cause of this entire problem was that the TBS stress was left unattended. So the government did not address the twin balance sheet problem to its very core. And that's why this actually expanded into a four balance sheet problem and came to haunt the government later on in 2019-2020. We're going to look into that. Now, to understand the TBS crisis and why it was left unresolved, we need to understand that what exactly is recapitalization and how do you resolve it. Now, when you say a bank is owned by Government of India, what we mean is that the share capital is majority in the Indian government's hand. That means 50% or more is basically held by the Government of India. Now, the way that this recapitalization happens and the way that you need to resolve this twin balance sheet problem is that these NPA needs to go away from the balance sheets of the banks. Now, apart from that, there is a ratio called capital adequacy ratio. Now, this ratio is technically called as tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital upon risk-weighted assets. It essentially means that if a bank lends 100 rupees, then how much of capital should it have in its pocket to support that 100 rupees? तो अगर एक बैंक 100 रुपए लोन दे रहा है तो उसको बैक करने के लिए उस 100 रुपए को बैक करने के लिए उसके पास खुद का कैपिटल कितना है. And all these norms were introduced by what is called as Basel norms. You will understand about these norms in a subject by the name of money and banking. Now, Basel is a place in Switzerland, and every few years there are different norms, prudential norms that are decided, and then they are applied to all the countries. Now, one of the norms is this capital adequacy ratio. Now, how does this capital adequacy ratio help a particular bank? It basically introduces its skin into the game. How? If a bank needs to lend 100 rupees, then it says that some amount of money or some percentage of that amount of money should be held with the bank in terms of its own capital. तो अगर आपको 100 रुपए लोन देना है तो उस 100 रुपए को सपोर्ट करने के लिए आपके पास अपने अकाउंट में अपने कैपिटल में 9 रुपीस होने चाहिए. So your own capital should be 9 rupees to support that 100 rupees loan. Now, if your risk-weighted asset, which is basically loan into the risk premium, you do not put the same amount of risk to every loan that you give. For example, अगर आप गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया को लोन दे रहे हो तो इट्स अ रिस्क फ्री लोन. गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एनी केस वापस कर देगा. इफ यू आर गिविंग 100 रुपीज टू से विजय माल्या, इट्स अ वेरी रिस्की लोन. इफ यू गिविंग 100 रुपीज टू मुकेश अंबानी, then it's a less risky loan. So what you do is the amount of loan that you give into the kind of risk that you are going to take or the risk that you're taking. So suppose आपका risk weighted assets 100 rupees के थे. So RBI says that 9 rupees is the capital that you need to maintain with yourself or you need to maintain to back those 100 rupees. Now अगर आपके NPA बढ़ रहा है तो आपके risks बढ़ रहे हैं, आपके risk weighted assets बढ़ रहे हैं, आपका premium वो सारा बढ़ रहा है. तो अगर ये 100 rupees से 200 rupees हो जाता है आपका risk weighted assets because of piling of NPAs, then what happens is कि ये 9 के बजाय अब आपको 18 rupees चाहिए to maintain that 9% because 18 upon 200 is also 9%, and 9% is what is mandated by RBI. Now, to maintain that 9%, that means the bank needs to get these extra 9 rupees. ये 9 से 18 जो लाने के लिए ये आपको ₹100 आपका लोन रिस्क वेटेड एसेट्स बढ़ गया है, तो दैट मीन्स यू नीड टू ऐड ₹9 to your capital. Now, where will this ₹9 come from? From the owners of the bank or from the retained profits, whatever is the case. And in case of public sector banks, the owners are Government of India. So Government of India needs to infuse this money. And that is exactly called as recapitalization of PSBs. And over the years, over the last few years, the Government of India has been infusing tremendous amount of money into the public sector banks. So पिछले पिछले 5-7 सालों में around more than 3 lakh crore rupees, 3 lakh crore rupees has been spent on recapitalization of these public sector banks. This has basically led to their common equity tier 1 capital to reach the minimum levels which are needed. So if you see, the common equity tier 1 capital ratio of public sector banks have increased to 10% above the regulatory minimum of 8%. That is because of this recapitalization that has happened over the years. However, what we still see is that the portrait of these bank loans can be seen here. Can you see? This is the line for public sector banks and this is the line for private sector banks. And these are all NPAs. And if you see, the problem is much more in public sector banks as compared to private sector banks. It was initially because of Raghuram Rajan had introduced what is called as asset quality review. So what Raghuram Rajan did in 2015 as the governor of RBI was that he asked all the banks to review their accounts and to come out clean with the fact that if they have any NPAs on their accounts. Now what these banks were doing before this period was that suppose किसी ने इनको पैसे वापस नहीं दिए, suppose someone owes SBI 1,000 crore rupees, and if that person is not able to pay back the interest on those 1,000 crore rupees, the bank used to give more loan to the particular entity so that they can pay the interest, at least the interest, so that they should not be able to show this NPA as in their accounts. So what Raghuram Rajan did was Raghuram Rajan stopped this practice of evergreening of loans and he said to all banks, please come up with the actual figures, and that is called as asset quality review. The moment he started this asset quality review in 2015, एकदम से you see a shoot up in your gross NPA as a percentage of advances. That means अगर आप 100 रुपए का एडवांस दे रहे हो एक पॉइंट पे, तो आप कह रहे हो उसमें से 14 रुपए तो मुझे वापस मिल ही नहीं रहे हैं, वो NPA कन्वर्ट हो रहा है. And this difference is in the quality of performance of public sector banks versus private sector banks. People think that public sector banks को आराम से चूना लगाया जा सकता है, you don't need to pay back these banks, and people were taking these banks very lightly, and therefore you see कि वहां पर उनका gross NPA बहुत ज्यादा है and यहाँ पर private sector banks में NPA बहुत कम है. ठीक है, relatively काफी कम है as compared to public sector banks. So एंड देन धीरे धीरे ये बैंक्स ने लोन देना कम शुरू कर दिया, बैंक्स ने अपना लोन का अमाउंट कम करना शुरू कर दिया, एज वेल एज एंड प्लस वी सॉ द रेजोल्यूशन ऑफ दीज एनपीएस थ्रू आईबीसी इन अ लेटर फेज. सो विल टॉक अबाउट ऑल ऑफ दैट एज वेल. सो विद टाइम व्हाट वी आर सीइंग इज कि ये एनपीए जो है वो गिर रहा है, बट स्टिल यू कैन सी द डिफरेंस बिटवीन द quality of performance of public sector banks versus private sector banks. The core problem is that the resolution of this bank stress, that means the NPA problem that banks had, was not being resolved. And one of the reasons is that the IBC, now what is this IBC? It's Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. This was introduced in 2016. And the reason it was introduced was that in a particular time frame, all of the bankruptcy issues can be resolved. So for example, कोई बैंक को लोन का पैसा वापस नहीं कर रहा, बैंक can take the particular company to IBC and say that ये entity, ये corporate entity जो है मेरा लोन नहीं वापस कर रही, we will either liquidate this company or IBC will appoint a particular resolution professional and they will help resolve the crisis of this particular company. So IBC, when it was envisaged, it was said that within 270 days, that means within an year, the problem will be resolved either through liquidation, that means आप auction कर दोगे पूरी company का, or you will find a particular solution. All the creditors will sit together and find a solution how to better run this company so that they can get their money back. That is called as committee of creditors. So a committee of creditors बैठती है और वो कमिटी ऑफ क्रेडिटर्स बेसिकली डिसाइड करती है कि how will they resolve this crisis of theirs, because they are the ones to whom the corporate owes the money. For example, एक company X है which owes money to these creditors. Now these creditors will sit together and suggest whether they want to resolve it by running the company, or transferring the company to someone else so that they can better run the company, or they want to liquidate the company. In terms of liquidation, वो आप बेच दोगे कंपनी को. So this was what was envisaged, but what we saw till 2019-20 was that the average time taken to resolve through IBC was much more than 270 days. Now, why is that a problem? That is a problem because जो कंपनी स्टक है, जो कंपनी स्ट्रेस है, जो पैसा वापस नहीं कर पा रही, आईबीसी के थ्रू उनके ओल्ड प्रमोटर्स तो रिमूव हो जाते थे, बट कोई नए प्रमोटर्स नहीं आ पा रहे थे. ठीक है, कोई नया मैनेजमेंट नहीं आ पा रहा था, और बिकॉज नया मैनेजमेंट नहीं आ पा रहा है, पुराने प्रमोटर्स हट गए हैं, एंड कंपनी जो है अभी भी बहुत अच्छे से परफॉर्म नहीं कर रही है, इसलिए उनके डेट्स और ज्यादा इंक्रीज हो रहे थे, उनका इंटरेस्ट और ज्यादा इंक्रीज हो रहा है. कंपनी का ऑलरेडी रेप्यूटेशन खराब हो चुका है मार्केट में, पीपल विल नॉट लेंड दैट कंपनी मच अमाउंट. सो बिकॉज ऑफ ऑल दीज रीजंस देयर डेट विल फर्दर इंक्रीज, जो कंपनीज आईबीसी को रेफर हो गई होंगी, एंड देयर एबिलिटी टू पे विल फर्दर डिमिनिश. एंड बिकॉज देयर एबिलिटी टू पे इज डिमिनिशिंग, देयर डेट्स आर इंक्रीजिंग, इसीलिए वो जो कॉस्ट है वो किसका है? वो बैंक्स का कॉस्ट है. बैंक्स को 1000 करोड़ रुपए फॉर एग्जांपल लेने थे, उस कंपनी की वैल्यू अब गिरे जा रही है. पहले उसकी कंपनी की वैल्यू 700 करोड़ थी, फिर धीरे धीरे उसकी 500 करोड़ हो गई, फिर उसके वैल्यू 200 करोड़ हो गई. तो अल्टीमेटली जो डिफरेंस है, what you will realize and what the loan that you had given is the difference that the banks will basically lose, and ultimately it is the loss of the taxpayers money. So this was the problem with IBC. So what we are saying is that the stress is now spreading like a virus beyond these legacy problems of banks and infrastructure firms. It is now getting into NBFCs जो पैसा दे रहे हैं. पहले बैंक्स पैसा दे रहे थे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर कंपनीज को, अब NBFCs पैसा दे रहे हैं रियल एस्टेट कंपनीज को. सो अब ये दो और बैलेंस शीट्स प्रॉब्लमैटिक होने वाली हैं, जिसको हम बोलते हैं 4 बैलेंस शीट चैलेंज, FBS challenge. You see this particular table, you can see that the recovery rate is very poor. How is it poor? For example, let's see SR Steel, Bhushan Steel. Bhushan Steel owed 57,000 crore rupees, but the amount that the banks were able to realize by selling this particular company to Tata was just 35,000 crore rupees. And at times companies have realized even smaller amount. For example, see this Alok Industries, 30,000 crore rupees it owed to the creditors. People were only able to realize 5,000 crore rupees. Only 17% was realized. So this is the money, this recovery rate. So 1 minus the recovery rate is the cost to these banks and all the creditors. So we can see that the recovery rate has not been very huge in terms of IBC then. So this was the problem of IBC. So we have covered the overview, we have covered structural and cyclical problem, we have covered the structural problems in the growth engine, we have also covered the unresolved TBS crisis. Now we will see that what has kept the economy going, that despite the TBS crisis, despite the fact that there was demonetization, despite the fact that there was GST and IBC, in सबके बावजूद, why was the economy growing between 2014 and 2018? We will get to that. Now, the economy has been going because of multiple reasons. There are 3 major cyclical reasons. One is exports, the other is hidden fiscal stimulus, and the third is unexpected credit stimulus. So these are the 3 reasons. Let's first see कि external side पे क्या हुआ. Now on the external side, what happened after mid of 2014 was oil ka price started falling from $110-120 a barrel. $110-120 a barrel से गिर के by the time of 2016 it crashed to $30 a barrel. 1/4 हो चुका था almost oil का price, and 85% of our requirement of oil is important. तो अगर हमारे import burden कम हो जाएगा तो the government will have more money to spend on other things. So government was very clever. इस time पे Arun Jaitley was the finance minister. What he did was the cost price for our oil was becoming cheaper, but the selling price of oil in the market was not reduced. Instead, government ने क्या किया, यहाँ से taxes उठाना शुरू कर दिया. It increased the taxes. So basically the reduction in oil prices was compensated by increase in taxes, which led to a higher increase in revenues of the government. And all of that led to at least 1 to 1.5% of growth rate between 2015 to 2017. So this was one of the reasons for the growth rate. The other three reasons from 2017 to 2018 was, one, because of the uptick in world demand started increasing and Indian rupee started depreciating. अगर Indian rupee depreciate करता है तो हमारे exports जो हैं वो ज़्यादा competitive हो जाते हैं. And this is where we see that the non-oil exports grew from -8% to +8% in 2017-18. तो हमारे exports 1-1.5 साल के लिए पिकअप करे बिकॉज हमारी करेंसी रियल सेंस में डिप्रिशिएट कर गई. Apart from that, there was a huge fiscal stimulus which was given by the government of India. Now, the government of India was hiding its fiscal deficit. On the face value, जब आप बजट देखते हो तो आपको बजट में दिखाई देगा कि गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया अपना फिस्कल डेफिसिट रिड्यूस कर रही है. सो व्हाट वी सी हियर इज दैट द गवर्नमेंट वाज हाइडिंग इट्स फिस्कल डेफिसिट through what is called as off balance sheet borrowing. Now the government was not borrowing on its own account, but the government was borrowing through FCI and through National Highway Authority of India. तो ऐसे PSUs को बोल रहे थे कि बोरो कर लो on basically on behalf of government of India rather than the government of India borrowing. But if you add all those, if you add off balance sheet liabilities and the state's own deficits as well, you can see that the overall deficit of the government of India was increasing. So while on the face value government का fiscal deficit कम हो रहा है, but if you see this, you can see that overall government of India's deficit was increasing. So government of India spend ज़्यादा कर रहा था, इसलिए आपकी growth ज़्यादा हो रही है. And the third reason is the NBFC lending boom. What happened after demonetization was that a lot of, everyone around us started depositing money back to the banks. So banks was flush with this money. And what these banks and mutual funds did with this money was they in turn lent this money to NBFCs. Now NBFCs are poorly regulated by RBI, at least till 2019-20. They were poorly regulated and they were part of what is called as shadow banking, because they did not completely come into the purview of RBI and they also did not come completely under the purview of SEBI. Therefore what we see was that they were now given a lot of money, and this money was now being lent to real estate companies by NBFCs. And when we will find that these companies, these real estate companies are in trouble, ultimately these NBFCs will not be able to raise the money that they owe to banks as well as mutual funds. So you would have a full-blown crisis in 2019-20, whereby the real estate companies who ultimately owe the money, NBFCs which have given money to real estate companies, the banks and mutual funds who have given money to NBFCs, and the earlier part of the previous TBS crisis, all of them are now in a situation of crisis, and that is called as a 4 balance sheet crisis. Now, so in our analysis, we have seen the overview, we have seen the structural and cyclical slowdown, we have seen how structural problems affect growth, we have seen the TBS stress, we have seen the what has kept the economy going, and now we need to study about why India's housing bubble had burst. So ultimately we found out that 2019-20 was the year where the real estate bubble in India collapsed or burst, and that led to the crisis which ultimately led to this 4 balance sheet problem. Now, the trigger of this particular crisis was the collapse of ILFS. Now, this infrastructure leasing and finance company had collapsed in 2018 when it had borrowed 90,000 crore rupees from the financial system. It defaulted on 90,000 crore rupees, which is a huge amount and which sent ripples across the financial system. And most of this money, जो ये money NBFCs ने दिया था, वो किसको दिया था? ये दिया था इन्होंने रियल एस्टेट कंपनीज को. And real estate companies were in a very bad situation. Why? Because if we see the analysis of top 8 cities, they had unsold inventory of 10 lakh units. 10 लाख यूनिट उनके बने हुए बट बिना बिके हुए पड़े हुए थे. Whereas their sales were only 2 lakh units. So on an average, every year they were adding 8 lakh units unsold. So this is, if you see the right side figure, you can see that the inventories, the unsold inventory is climbing, whereas the gap between these two is rising. Your sales, their sales realization and the inventory sold realization, इसका gap जो है वो increase होता हुआ जा रहा है. And if we see the real estate loan exposure, major real estate loan exposure किसने लिया हुआ है? If you see till 2015 जो था, आपको रियल एस्टेट कंपनीज को NBFC भी दे रहा था, प्राइवेट बैंक्स भी दे रहा था और PSUs भी दे रहा था. हाँ, ऑलमोस्ट इक्वल अमाउंट दे रहा था. But post 2015, post 2016, you see a huge percentage change in terms of NBFCs. More than 50% of their loans were being borrowed by, or more than 50% of the real estate loans were coming from NBFCs. So NBFCs का जो exposure था वो बहुत ज्यादा होना शुरू हो गया फॉर रियल एस्टेट. व्हेन दिस सर्ज ऑफ सप्लाई आउटपेस डिमांड, बेसिकली सप्लाई ऑफ हाउसेस इज आउटपेसिंग द डिमांड ऑफ हाउसिंग, और उसको फाइनेंस करने के लिए आपको नए घर और बनाने हैं. सो बेसिकली यू आर सेइंग कि बिल्डर्स जो हैं वो सप्लाई बनाए जा रहे हैं बट उनका सामान बिक नहीं रहा है, तो नया सामान बनाने के लिए भी तो दे नीड मनी. So that money was being raised from NBFC. So it was kind of a Ponzi scheme कि आप एक जने को पैसा देने के लिए दूसरे जने से पैसा ले रहे हो. ठीक है. So that kind of a Ponzi scheme was unsustainable and this Ponzi scheme burst in 2019. And this led to huge problems in the banking industry as well, because some state banks had lent 10 to 14% of their loan books to just these NBFCs. So we had this full blown crisis in 2019-20. Because banks initially had stopped giving money. बैंक्स अपने आप में पहले पैसा नहीं दे रहा था. अब NBFC से भी पैसा नहीं आना शुरू हो गया क्योंकि NBFCs भी अब क्राइसिस में आ गए. सो ओवरऑल क्रेडिट एक्सपेंशन इन द इकोनॉमी स्लोड डाउन, एंड बिकॉज ओवरऑल क्रेडिट एक्सपेंशन इन द इकोनॉमी स्लोड डाउन, द इन्वेस्टमेंट्स इन द कंट्री slowed down. Now the stress in the industry can be seen by the difference between the lending rates and the nominal growth rate of the economy. So lending rate को हम कह रहे हैं I and nominal growth rate को बोल रहे हैं G. Now on an average you would expect a company to grow at the rate at which the economy is growing. तो अगर इकोनॉमी 10% से ग्रो कर रही है तो आप कहोगे कि अच्छा हाँ, कंपनी भी ऑन एन एवरेज भी 10% से ग्रो कर रही है और कंपनी के रेवेन्यूज भी 10% से ग्रो कर रहे हैं. बट अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट जो है वो 12% है तो कंपनी की ग्रोथ से ज्यादा इंटरेस्ट रेट आपका है. So if the growth rate exceeds the interest on corporate debt, then the corporates will find it easier to service their debt. So if the growth rate, अगर ये growth rate जो है अगर ये 12% का और interest rate 10% का हो, then the companies will be able to service their debt. So if the growth rate exceeds the interest on corporate debt, then the corporates will find it easier to service their debt. But if this is rising, that means if interest rate is more than your growth rate, then there will be more of debt stress. So ultimately we can summarize that this entire problem that we had in the economy was a race between stimulus and stress. जब भी आपका स्ट्रेस आता था, गवर्नमेंट कोई स्टिमुलस प्रोवाइड कर रही थी, कोई ना कोई स्टिमुलस प्रोवाइड कर रहा था, फिर आपका स्ट्रेस कम हो जाता था, फिर कोई स्ट्रेस आता था, फिर कोई स्टिमुलस आया था, तो ये स्ट्रेस और स्टिमुलस के बीच में रेस चल रही थी. अल्टीमेटली ये कभी ना कभी तो ये साइकिल बर्स्ट होनी थी, एंड इट बर्स्टेड इन 2019-2000. So we have covered the entire topic where we have covered the overview, the cyclical versus structural debate, the structural problems, the unresolved issue, the what has kept the economy going, the housing bubble, and now we are to the final part, which is that what is the solution to this TBS problem and to this slowdown problem. Now, if we see the remedies for the solution, the remedies of the solution are twofold. One is a negative list. Now, what is a negative list? These are all measures that the government has already taken, but these are not working. So the typical monetary and fiscal policies that the government has taken are not helping. Let's take the monetary policy first. The problem is जो हमने transmission की बात करी थी वो that is broken. So so RBI is reducing the repo rate, but उसकी reduction of repo rate से banks जो है वो अपना lending rate cut नहीं कर रहे हैं. सो दैट ट्रांसमिशन की रेपो रेट कम होगा, रेपो रेट की वजह से बैंक्स का जो रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट है वो कम हो जाएगा. दैट इज नॉट हैपनिंग. सो बैंक्स आर नॉट रिड्यूसिंग देयर लेंडिंग रेट्स एंड देयरफॉर देयर इज नो इम्पैक्ट ऑन द क्रेडिट साइकिल. जब बैंक्स अपना लेंडिंग रेट ही कम नहीं कर रहे तो इन्वेस्टमेंट भी पिक नहीं हो रही है. सो दिस इज वन प्रॉब्लम. And what we see is that the difference between the lending rate and the repo rate has spread to around 5 percentage points. That means lending rate जो है वो repo rate. This is the rate at which banks borrow and this is the rate at which banks lend. So ये जो difference है ये इसको बोलते हैं lending minus repo rate या policy rate का spread. That spread has increased to 5 percentage points. बहुत ज़्यादा spread हो गया. So which means that the transmission of monetary policy is not effective. Let's come to fiscal policies. In terms of fiscal policies, टैक्स कट करना तो बहुत आसान है इंडिया में. आपको पॉलिटिक्स में आपको वोट जीतना है, आप टैक्स कट कर दो, ठीक है. बट दे आर वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू रिवर्स. एक बार आपने किसी को ये आदत डाल दी टैक्स कट की या फिर सब्सिडीज की, तो वो इंडिया जैसी कंट्री के अंदर ये लेना वापस बहुत ज्यादा मुश्किल है. So therefore, this is not a feasible solution. In fact, what should we think? We should be thinking about should be how to increase the tax base. हम कैसे बहुत और ज़्यादा tax payers को tax net के अंदर ला सकें. So that should be our objective. The second solution that is not working is that अभी जो fiscal stimulus है उसकी और space ही नहीं रह गई है. Even in the pre-pandemic era, we saw that हमारा जो कंसोलिडेटेड फिस्कल डेफिसिट है, कंबाइंड फिस्कल डेफिसिट है, वो 8.8% पे है. सो इवन प्री पैंडेमिक हमारा इतना ज्यादा हाई फिस्कल डेफिसिट है, दैट मींस आपके पास फिस्कल स्पेस ही नहीं है और डेफिसिट रन करने की. अगर गवर्नमेंट और सिक्योरिटीज प्रिंट करेगा तो उसकी वजह से क्या होगा, मार्केट में रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट और बढ़ेगा. अगर गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया और बॉन्ड्स बेच देता है मार्केट के अंदर तो क्या होगा, मार्केट के अंदर जो पैसा है वो कम हो जाएगा. बैंक्स जो है ये बॉन्ड्स खरीद लेंगे क्योंकि सेफ बॉन्ड्स हैं. बाकी मार्केट के लिए पैसा कम बच जाएगा, विच इज क्राउडिंग आउट. सो इफ गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया प्रिंट्स मोर बॉन्ड्स और sells more bond, it will lead to crowding out. If that crowding out will lead to increase in interest rates. मार्केट में कम पैसा बचा, इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ जाएगा. अगर इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ जाएगा तो उसका इंपैक्ट होगा, प्राइस ऑफ बॉन्ड्स विल फॉल. इफ प्राइस ऑफ बॉन्ड्स विल फॉल देन व्हाट विल हैपन, देयर विल बी ट्रेजरी लॉस फॉर बैंक्स. सो सपोज एक पर्टिकुलर बैंक ने 100 रुपए का फेस वैल्यू का बॉन्ड खरीदा हुआ है. नाउ व्हाट हैपेंस इफ द इंटरेस्ट रेट इंक्रीजेस, देन दिस ये जो 100 रुपए का उसने बॉन्ड खरीदा हो सकता है उसकी वैल्यू सिर्फ 90 रुपीज रह जाए. तो बैंक्स के एसेट्स की वैल्यू भी कम हो रही है. सो देयरफॉर सेलिंग मोर बॉन्ड्स फ्रॉम द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया इन फॉर्म ऑफ G-Secs is also not a viable strategy. And in any case, interest rates are way too high for any expansion of fiscal deficit. So none of these policies, neither monetary policy nor your traditional fiscal policy is working. So then what can be done? Now for that we have the positive list. What is this positive list? These are things which the government should do to resolve this crisis. Now the first thing that the government should be doing is to address this 4 balance sheet challenge. Now there are 5 steps to address this 4 balance sheet challenge. The first step is recognition of the problem. Now पहले आपको प्रॉब्लम समझने के लिए कि प्रॉब्लम की डेप्थ क्या है उसको समझना जरूरी है कि कितनी डीप है वो प्रॉब्लम. For that what we need is a entire comprehensive overview of the financial sector. तो जैसे रघुराम राजन ने आपका फाइनेंशियल बैंक्स का आपका एसेट क्वालिटी रिव्यू कराया था, व्हाट वी नीड इज AQR 2.0, where not just the financials, not just the banks, but the accounts and the balance sheets of banks, NBFCs and mutual funds should be checked again and see कि उनके पास कितना stress है अपने accounts में. The second thing that needs to be done is resolution. एक बार आपको NPA पता चल गया, आपको प्रॉब्लम पता चल गई, then you need to resolve this NPA through IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and ensure that all participants have the incentives to solve the issue. For example, अगर कोई बंदा willful defaulter है, for example people like विजय माल्या जो willful defaulter है, willful defaulter कौन होते हैं? जो एक्चुअली में पैसा दे सकते हैं बट देना नहीं चाहते हैं. उन्होंने अपना पैसा या तो एक प्रोजेक्ट से लेके जानबूझ के दूसरे प्रोजेक्ट में लगा दिया. सो ऐसे जो लोग हैं वो लोग आईबीसी के पूरे प्रोसेस को स्टॉल ना कर पाए. एंड कुछ सिचुएशंस में आपको बैड बैंक्स क्रिएट करने पड़ेंगे. ये स्पेशलाइज्ड एजेंसीज हैं जो बैंक से और एनबीएफसी से उनके एनपीए खरीद लेगा. फॉर एग्जाम्पल एक बैंक का 100 रुपए का एनपीए है. सो these bad banks will buy this NPA from the bank at 60 rupees. So बैंक को 40 रुपीज का लॉस हो चुका है. अब ये बैड बैंक जो है इसने 60 रुपीज का लिया इससे, अब रिकवर करने की कोशिश करेगा किसी तरीके से 80 रुपीज. Now the next step is regulation. Now you have to bring all the financial institutions, entities under the purview of RBI supervision. Now, this is something which has been happening recently. If you've been reading the newspapers, you will get to know that now RBI has brought all major NBFCs under its purview now. And from 2022 October, all of the major NBFCs and all of the major NBFCs will be under the purview of RBI's supervision. Then the next step is recapitalization. सो जहां जो बैंक्स का कैपिटल इरोड हुआ है और मिनिमम कैपिटल नहीं है, वहां पर गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया को आपको कैपिटल डालना पड़ेगा, इन्फ्यूज करना पड़ेगा कैपिटल. द लास्ट स्टेप इज रिफॉर्म. नाउ रिफॉर्म इज वन ऑफ द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट स्टेप्स वेयर द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया हैज टू स्टॉप इंटरफेयरिंग इनटू द बिजनेस ऑफ पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स. So it has to give complete independence to the working of public sector banks. It has to help these public sector banks enable in technology. And finally, it has to think about privatization of some of these banks so that there is shrinkage in public sector banking activities and some part of it can be taken up by the private sector. And last but not the least, the article also talks about that we need better data, better real-time data for better policies to have big bang effect over economic outcome. This was all about the reading of Professor Arvind Subramanian. Discussion.